All right, greetings everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. This session is now being recorded. Thank you so much for joining tonight's session, How to Spot Fake News in 2020, Misinformation Trends in the US Election. I'm Sarah Brandt. I head up our news literacy programs at NewsGuard, which is a startup staffed by journalists that fights misinformation by rating the credibility of news websites. At NewsGuard, I manage our partnerships with more than 750 public libraries in the US and Europe. And many of you joining or watching this recording are likely staff or community members from one of our many library partners. And so if that's true of you, I want to say thank you so much for being a partner and helping us in the fight against misinformation. If your local library is not currently a NewsGuard partner, please feel free to get in touch about how you can become a partner. It's a simple partnership and it's totally free thanks to sponsorship from Microsoft and Oscar Health. And all it really entails is that we provide public libraries with free access to the NewsGuard browser extension for use on their computers. So today I am joined by Melissa Golden, who is a staff analyst and news literacy associate for NewsGuard. He's based in Brooklyn. And Gabby Deutsch, who is NewsGuard's Washington correspondent, focusing on US politics. I'm very excited to turn it over to the two of them who have a really interesting session to present, but first I want to go over just a few housekeeping items. So the presentation will run for approximately 50 minutes with about 10 minutes left at the end for Q&A. You'll be muted during the presentation and during the Q&A session, so please use the chat box at any point during the presentation to ask your questions. I'll be monitoring the chat box throughout and we'll make sure that your questions get addressed during the Q&A session at the end. And just a reminder, this session is being recorded and it will be distributed to all registrants afterwards via email. With that, I will turn it over to Gabby and Melissa. Thank you again.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. We are very excited to have you with us and to discuss misinformation and trends related to the election and coronavirus and the many news events of 2020. So thank you for joining us and spending your Wednesday evening with us. So we are going to discuss some of the trends that we've seen in misinformation, which we define as false information and misleading information that is spread online. And as Sarah mentioned, we are a team of journalists who rate the credibility of thousands of news websites online. In the process of doing these ratings, we have learned quite a bit about what kind of false information is trending online, how it relates to politics and health and many other topics. So that's what we are excited to share with you here. And our goal is not only to teach you about these trends, but also to give you an awareness of how misinformation spreads, why it spreads, why people are creating this information, and also to help you protect yourself against it and to be able to distinguish between credible news online and misinformation, misleading information, and everything in between. So the first example that I want to mention are these two websites, the Denver Post and the Denver Guardian. And I want you to think, if you're looking just at this slide, you see the names of these two websites and their logos and no other information. So if you're, for example, scrolling through your Facebook feed, you might see an article shared from either of these, and unless you're from Denver or even Colorado, it probably doesn't mean much to you. So one of these websites is the website of a Pulitzer Prize winning news organization. The other is a hoax website that was created and designed to spread misinformation, false stories that were made to go viral. And this is the Denver Guardian. If you're looking just at the names, it's probably hard to tell, but this was a website that was created in 2016 by a person named Justin Kohler. He actually is a Democrat who has stated that he wanted to try to trick Republicans with false stories that he created. So this was one example, an article with the headline, FBI agent suspected in Hillary email leaks found dead in apparent murder-suicide, suggesting some conspiracy between the FBI and Hillary Clinton and pitting these two people against each other. And this article was shared more than 500,000 times on Facebook. And it was completely fabricated, completely false. The person who created it, Justin Kohler, ran a company called Disinfo Media that operated numerous websites like this that had no purpose other than to trick people. So this story went viral ahead of the election, and at the time when it was figured out who was running these websites, Justin Kohler was upfront about his goal. He told NPR, "The whole idea from the start was to build a site that could infiltrate the echo chambers of the alt-right, publish blatantly false or fictional stories, and then be able to publicly denounce those stories and point out the fact that they were fiction." But to most people, if they saw this story on Facebook, they didn't know the context about who was publishing it and why, and that it was all a big joke to him. They saw a news story that they assumed to be true because it looked like it was from a credible news source. And the reality is it can be very hard to tell the difference between these sources. But this was 4 years ago. The Denver Guardian no longer exists. If you were to go to the website, you couldn't access this story. And Justin Kohler, who ran the site, retired from the fake news business. I'm not sure what he's doing now. So what's happened in the years since? What we do at NewsGuard, as Sarah mentioned before, is rate thousands of news and information websites for credibility and transparency. And we were created in 2018 out of a need that we saw to try and help consumers and people online understand the difference between credible sources and unreliable sources. So just as a brief explanation, we use 9 criteria, which are listed on the side of the slide, to assess these websites. We apply them equally. They're websites that all journalism organizations seek to uphold in their work. The result is that a website will earn either a green check mark, as you see on the left, which indicates that it's a reliable website, or a red exclamation point, which if you were to see it when you were looking at a website, it would warn you, think twice maybe before trusting what you're reading here. And the idea is to give people context for their news so that if they're scrolling on Facebook or Google or any other place on the internet and they see a link that a friend of theirs shared, that they're able to put context to it and think, should I trust this source or shouldn't I? So a brief timeline of where we fit in with this fake news problem. Misinformation is not new to 2016. I'm sure many of you, probably most of you, know the term fake news, which really originated during the 2016 campaign and spread widely. But just because that term was new in 2016 does not mean that the problem of false information being spread by politicians or foreign governments or people who are trying to pull pranks was a new problem. But because now so many people get their news from the internet and from social media, that misinformation is able to spread much more quickly. So we were founded NewsGuard 2 years ago, and since then we have rated more than 6,000 websites in the US and Europe. And in that time, we have been able to glean a lot about these major narratives and misinformation. What's changed since 2016? Who are the major players? And importantly, why are they doing this? And how can you avoid it? These are the 6 sort of basic categories that we think about misinformation or fake news in. There's imposter content, like the Denver Guardian, which is meant to trick people who are actually looking for legitimate news, perhaps somebody who lives in Denver and wants to know what's going on in their community. But in reality, they could end up at this website that serves no purpose other than to misinform. There's hoax websites, which are meant to spread viral stories. We see this often with websites that are created and spreading false news about pop culture. So there's a whole host of websites out there that you might have seen saying that a certain celebrity died or a certain celebrity was involved in certain bad activity. And those stories can easily go viral, and that's really the only purpose that they serve. A very important category, which you perhaps have encountered this year, is health misinformation. So this is false claims about any topic in health: vaccines, cancer, diabetes, ways to cure these illnesses. And of course, in the course of the coronavirus pandemic this year, health misinformation has been growing at, unfortunately, a really huge pace. It's spread in many places online, and it's something that we've been working to combat. And we'll talk more about health and coronavirus specifically later on. Conspiracy theories, some of the oldest misinformation in the book, you might be familiar with the conspiracy theory, for example, that John F. Kennedy was actually, the murder of John F. Kennedy involved multiple people. One was arrested, but there are conspiracy theories that one more or several more, or lots of other people were involved and the government is hiding it and trying to cover it up. And what conspiracy theories do is try to explain an event as being the result of a secret plot by people in power. Often they have political motivations, and conspiracy theories will tie scattered pieces of evidence into a single narrative, and then they'll deny evidence that runs counter to that theory, even if, of course, that evidence disproves their theory. Propaganda, this is referring often to information, ideas, rumors that are spread deliberately and widely to help a certain group or to harm another group or entity or even a political institution. This is information that's often biased or misleading, and it promotes a certain ideology or point of view or political motivation. So you probably heard about Russian propaganda, which the government figured out was used widely to try to influence American voters in the 2016 election. It's still a problem today, and the government has even warned that we're seeing propaganda attempts from China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other countries to try to interfere in the US election this year. And the last category that we're going to talk about today is websites that are spreading a hidden agenda. So these are places that have a political agenda, something they're trying to accomplish, but that they don't make clear to the readers. Especially in an election year, this is something to be wary of. A lot of politicians will create websites that are meant to look like news sites. These are sites that they'll use to prop themselves up. A candidate might share an article from a site that looks like news and say, look how well I'm doing, this newspaper supports me, but in reality, they might be running that website themselves and not telling readers who they are and what they're doing. So these are the general categories that we'll look at, and we'll go through some examples of all of these. And then the next question is, why are the people who create and spread misinformation doing it? It's not just because they like to watch people go crazy and believe false things, although that is part of it. So one of the most basic motivations, of course, is money. All of these websites, when people go to read them, generate ad revenue for the sites. So the more people who read them, the more money they make from advertising. And for a lot of websites as well, they're also selling some kind of product. And this is something we see a lot on health websites. So a website might be telling you, hey, I have this miracle cure for cancer. And then conveniently, they also sell that vitamin or medicine or whatever it is on their website. And these are often products that have not been proven by doctors or even have been found to be dangerous and are largely unregulated. And this passes really under the radar. And the people selling these products are able to make money by misinforming their readers. The next category is power. This is something we discussed before in terms of websites that are spreading propaganda. So they're spreading misinformation in order to back up their own views, in order to help their political agenda, in order to win an election. Another motivation is entertainment. So think back to the Denver Guardian and the person who ran it, who had no goal other than to spread false information and see how well it was able to spread on Facebook. It was sort of an experiment of sorts, and then the result was people being terribly misinformed, and he sort of sat back and just laughed. So you might also think of this as trolling. And lastly, unfortunately, sometimes misinformation can spread as a result of sloppiness. A lot of websites that we have found to be generally unreliable, on first glance, might actually look like a real news source, like the Denver Guardian, like many others that sort of pretend to be sites that they're not. For example, one website called BuzzFeed News that's spelled news with a Z. At first glance, it looks totally okay. So many real news organizations might see these stories and repost them without stopping to validate the story first. And the result is that they're then spreading a misinformation narrative, even if it is by accident. And so ahead of the 2020 election, of course, a very consequential election, we're seeing all of these forms of misinformation driven by these really distinct motivations. Some of the trends that we're seeing today have parallels dating back to 2016, and others are new or building off of old narratives. And so Melissa's going to speak about some of those comparisons.
Thanks, Gabby. So as we transition to talking more about specific trends we've seen leading up to the 2020 election, we have another little brain teaser for you. Up on the screen, you'll see 3 websites: the Wilkes Journal Patriot, the Patriot Ledger and the Patriot Journal. And I just want you to think for a second, maybe write in the chat box if you want to see if you can distinguish between these three sites. What kind of sites are they? What might their differences be? Their similarities? What kind of news might they report? Just based on their name and maybe their logo. Obviously, their names are quite similar, so it might be difficult to tell the difference between them at first glance. But the journal, Wilkes Journal Patriot, is a newspaper in North Carolina. The Patriot Ledger is a newspaper in Boston. And although the Patriot Journal sounds nearly indistinguishable from these other two news sources, it's actually an opinion website that publishes conservative analysis on current events. It also fails to disclose a very important fact about itself, that it's owned by a political consultant named Ryan Malden, who has provided services to Republican campaigns. So why does this matter? Well, since the Patriot Journal doesn't tell readers that Ryan Malden owns the site, this presents a huge opportunity for a major conflict of interest. The Patriot Journal often writes articles that are critical of Democrats, so these articles could easily be advancing the electoral prospects of the Republicans for whom Malden works. And readers, if they don't know that Malden owns the website, won't know about this conflict of interest. So with that in mind, I'd like to talk a little bit more about sites that have political connections and why those connections can pose issues for readers. Up on the site, up on the screen, you'll now see two different websites, the American Independent and the Patriot Project. They have very similar names and obviously very similar logos as well. They both have political connections, although they both report news from very different perspectives. So to delve a little bit deeper into each of them, the American Independent is a liberal news site, and it was founded by Democratic operative David Brock. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the site's ownership structure and its political connections and why those matter. It gets a little bit complicated, so stay with me and we'll get through it together. The American Independent is owned by True Blue Media, which is a private company, and that private company is financed by investments from individuals and foundations. The site also receives public donations through its nonprofit arm, the American Independent Foundation. In addition to those two sources of revenue, it has also received millions of dollars from the American Bridge 21st Century Foundation, which is a politically active liberal nonprofit. It's also referred to as a dark money group, which is a term used to describe nonprofits that choose not to disclose their donors, although they're not legally required to. So American Independent, the website, discloses its ownership by True Blue Media and its relationship to the American Independent Foundation, the nonprofit that supports the site. But it doesn't disclose the donors to the foundation, nor does it clearly describe that the American Bridge 21st Century Foundation is a politically active liberal organization. It also doesn't disclose David Brock's history of political activism. So again, why does this matter? The site's reporting is generally factual, but the fact that they don't disclose all of these political connections means that there is a chance for a major conflict of interest because the site is reporting news from a liberal perspective. So these political connections could easily impact their reporting. And at NewsGuard, we believe that readers have a right to know about that so that they have more context for what they're reading. So we overall rated the American Independent as generally not credible because of this lack of disclosure. On the other side of the aisle, you have the Patriot Project. The Patriot Project is a news and opinion site that covers US politics and crime from a conservative perspective, and it's owned by a Tea Party-linked nonprofit called Tea Party Patriots Action, Inc. And that nonprofit, appropriately enough, supports Tea Party initiatives. The site clearly discloses its ownership by the nonprofit, but it doesn't name any of the organization's major donors. However, we still rated the site as generally credible because the content they publish is generally factual, and because although the site doesn't disclose its donors, which would be ideal, they're not hiding their political connections, their ownership by a nonprofit. So readers do know that there is a political connection going on and have that context when they're reading a site with a conservative perspective. So this is coming from both sides of the aisle. It's not an issue that is singular to one or the other. But this isn't the only way we've seen sites hide a political agenda. In the year leading up to next month's election, we've also seen loads of sites crop up that sound like local news, but are actually politically motivated. They have names like Pennsylvania Capital Star, the Minnesota Sun, At North News, and Seattle City Wire. And they're often part of larger networks that publish many of these sites at once. You'll see some of those examples on the screen, like States Newsroom, Star News Digital Media, Courier Newsroom, Metric Media. And these sites are really playing off people's inherent trust in local news, which is especially important because local news is disappearing across the country. So when people see these sites, they might just think, oh, it's just a regular local news site. They don't have any particular agenda because they sound a lot like your typical local news site or local newspaper. But this is particularly important because many people don't have other options for the local news that they're looking for or other points of comparison. So if they're reading something with an agenda, they might not have anything to compare it to see how that story might play out if the person writing it didn't have a hidden agenda that they were going toward as well. So it creates an easy opportunity for networks like these to advance their political agendas on unsuspecting readers. There are also occasionally fake local news sites that don't have a political agenda. In the center of the screen, you'll see two examples of those sites, Albany Daily News and Breaking News 13. Often they're after programmatic advertising money, like Gabby was talking about before, but it can often be difficult to always ascertain a clear motive. So I just want to dive a little bit deeper into two of these networks. On one side of the political aisle, you have Courier Newsroom, which publishes sites that advance liberal interests. And the network is owned by a liberal nonprofit called Acronym, which has a PAC that is appropriately named Acronym. And that PAC has spent millions of dollars on Democratic candidates. The sites in the Acronym network only describe themselves as progressive, which might imply liberal to a lot of people, but at NewsGuard, we've determined that that's not a clear enough disclosure of a liberal perspective because it's a broad term that can also mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have Star News Digital Media, which is a network of sites that advance conservative interests. These sites are owned by Tea Party activists. And although sites in the network disclose their owners' work within the Tea Party movement, they don't explicitly disclose that they have a conservative perspective. So with that, I'll hand it back to Gabby to start discussing some specific misinformation we've seen regarding the 2020 election.
Something that I think we've all probably heard a lot about in recent weeks is discussion about mail-in voting, absentee voting, a question of fraud, risks. This year, because of the coronavirus pandemic, more people than ever have taken an interest in voting by mail because some people are worried that going to polling places might put them at risk for the coronavirus. And it's important to mention that voter fraud is real, but certain narratives will overstate the extent to which it exists. Certain narratives will understate it and really leave out the facts of this narrative. And myths about the election are really designed to undermine faith in voting, even to encourage people not to vote or to convince people that the outcome of an election is illegitimate or to confuse people or any number of reasons that really undermine democracy and voting in the US. And it can lead to legitimate confusion, but it's also important to know that there is official information. There are sources you can visit like vote.gov to get the most up-to-date, official, and accurate information about voting. So here are a couple of specific myths that I want to mention about voting, about the election. One of which is exaggerating the scale and the risk of mail-in voting fraud. There are people who have been arrested and charged with various acts of voter fraud in recent years, for example, voting twice or voting on behalf of someone else, but these instances are really, really rare, like 0.0004 of 1%. I'm not sure the exact number, but it's in the hundreds, and hundreds of millions of people are voting every year. So think about how small that number is. Which is not to say it's not important, but it is to say that fraud does not discount the results of an entire election. Another myth about election integrity and voting is a claim that one side, one political party, is bribing people to vote for their candidate. These are claims that, the other side is going door to door, they're paying people who answer to fill out their ballot in a certain way. And this is something that has not been proven to happen at any kind of scale. There have been a couple of isolated instances, but again, it's extremely rare, and rare enough that it says nothing about the integrity of the overall voting process. And lastly, one myth that is really unique to this year, a lot of states have been telling voters that, really warning voters that we likely will not have an answer to who our next president will be on election night on November 3rd. Because so many people are voting by mail and voting absentee, a lot of state election officials are saying that it will take a long time to count those votes, perhaps a few days, hopefully just a few days at most, but trying to explain to voters that this might be more of a long process than we're used to in past elections. Of course, if you think about 2000 and Bush v. Gore, it's not entirely new that an election might not be decided on election night, but because of the coronavirus pandemic, it's happening in a different way this year. There are some people who are spreading the misinformation online that any votes counted after election day are illegal. And that's simply not true. All votes must be counted. That is the law. If somebody casts a ballot legally, then their vote will be counted. And it must be counted by a certain date, by, I believe it's December 8th. That's when the votes are needed to be tallied by the Electoral College, but that's over a month after Election Day. So there is a possibility, and it is legal, that votes might be counted after November 3rd. Next, I want to mention, just as examples, two examples of misinformation, of falsehoods being spread by each side of the political aisle, just to show how misinformation can take on a political form as well, as you perhaps have even seen on social media yourself. So this is one claim that has been spread by some misinformation publishers on the right about Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris was born in California in the 1960s, and the qualification to be president is that you are a natural-born citizen. So being born in California, this would qualify Kamala Harris to be the vice president or the president. But the strain of misinformation about this is that because her parents were immigrants, her mother was from India and her father is from Jamaica, and because they were not yet US citizens at the time of Kamala Harris's birth, that she cannot be a natural-born citizen. And this is a question that has been settled by the Supreme Court. It's in federal law, it's in the Constitution, and this is a settled issue. But the misinformation that spread was really this anti-immigrant narrative that said that Kamala Harris herself cannot be a natural-born citizen. This is not true, but this spread very quickly. First, last year when Kamala Harris announced that she was running to be president, and then earlier this year in August when she was chosen by Joe Biden to be his running mate, this misinformation resurfaced, which is something we see as well, that certain threads of misinformation, certain narratives will arise at one time and sort of fade and go away and then come back when that person or topic is in the news again. Next, I want to talk about a strain of misinformation that we have seen spread more by people on the left. President Trump announced he had coronavirus almost 2 weeks ago, and there were people on the left who questioned whether he actually had COVID-19, who said, his diagnosis can't be true, I don't believe it, he's lying about it, despite having absolutely no basis for them to say that. His diagnosis has been confirmed by his doctor. President Trump was treated for coronavirus at Walter Reed, the hospital in Maryland. He gave the public information from medical professionals. explaining that he had the coronavirus. There is absolutely no evidence to suggest that he or anyone close to him was lying about this, but that didn't stop this misinformation from spreading among certain people on the left. It was not advanced by people at the top of the political party, but that does not mean that it was not still problematic and able to spread very quickly. This is something when you see misinformation spread online, it often happens at that sort of grassroots level among people who are on social media, among sort of fringe websites that themselves might not have that big of a readership, but if they attract the attention of a person who has a large following on social media, they might be able to reach a lot of people. And so these very conspiratorial claims were able to spread quickly, but of course were immediately debunked by the fact that the president did test positive for the virus.
So another trend we're seeing a lot of in the lead up to the 2020 election is QAnon. You might have heard about QAnon because it's been in the news quite a lot recently, but in case you haven't heard of it, or if you need a little bit of a refresher on what it is, QAnon is a conspiracy theory that posits that Donald Trump is on a secret mission to rid the world of the cabal of elites, which includes Hillary Clinton, Bill Gates, George Soros, and other top Democrats. QAnon followers believe that these elites control a deep state that hides a sprawling network of what they call pedocriminals. Just to be clear, this is completely false and has no basis in reality. It's purely conspiracy theory. It also has a lot of different variations. If you Google what is QAnon, you'll come up with 1,000 different answers, all of which vary slightly from one another, but that's the basic general idea of what QAnon is positing. Just to give you an idea of how expansive and how serious this has become, in 2019, the FBI actually listed QAnon as a potential domestic terrorism threat. So where did this conspiracy come from? It started in the US in October 2017 with posts on 4chan by an anonymous user who went by the letter Q. If you don't know about 4chan, it's an online forum known for spreading conspiracy theories and other inappropriate content. Q soon amassed thousands of followers and claimed without evidence to be a White House insider with Q-level security clearance who had access to classified information. Q's messages that he or she posted on 4chan became known as Q drops or breadcrumbs. QAnon, the conspiracy theory, emerged out of another conspiracy theory called Pizzagate. Pizzagate claims that Hillary Clinton and other top Democrats were involved in a child sex ring that was run out of a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. And this conspiracy started in 2016. It's also completely false and has no basis in reality. Q followers have also been instrumental in fueling Pizzagate because Pizzagate and QAnon have very similar themes. So they really feed off of one another. We've seen a huge resurgence in QAnon as we lead up to the election next month. And that's often because people in the public eye have really begun to promote it and bring it from the fringe into the limelight. So it's no longer a random conspiracy theory floating around the dark corners of the internet. It's really in the public eye in front of people who might not have seen it otherwise. So for example, members of the mainstream Republican Party have helped bring the theory from these dark corners into the limelight, as I was saying. So as of August 2020, there were 11 Republican congressional nominees who were QAnon supporters, and Trump and his inner circle have shared Q's content on numerous occasions. Another reason QAnon might be gaining popularity is because at its core, it's really a narrative about good vanquishing the evil that is responsible for all the problems of the world. So the state of the economy has people anxious and uncertain. COVID-19 has upended many, many things about the way we live our lives, and trust in US institutions is generally low across the board. QAnon gives people the answers that they're looking for, which is why it might be so appealing to so many. Jeffrey Epstein's arrest last year also fed into the conspiracy's child trafficking narrative. QAnon's been called a big tent conspiracy theory because it's constantly evolving. It's always incorporating new themes, so it's very flexible and pliable. Some new themes that we've seen leading up to the election, in addition to misinformation about the election itself, include misinformation about COVID-19, the Black Lives Matter protests, and the anti-vaccine and anti-child trafficking movements, among many other causes. For example, there was a campaign called #SaveTheChildren, which was started by actual anti-child trafficking NGOs, but was hijacked by QAnon followers to lead unsuspecting internet users to QAnon content who might not have seen it otherwise and were looking for something very, very different. You also might have heard a few months ago the furniture retailer Wayfair was said by Q's followers to be a child sex trafficking operation, which is false, complete fabrication related to the QAnon conspiracy. QAnon has also spread to many other countries recently, including ones in Europe. In late 2019 and early 2020, many new QAnon websites, pages, groups, and accounts appeared in the UK, France, Italy, and Germany, and quickly amassed large numbers of followers. Plus, older accounts, groups, and pages started sharing QAnon theories. And when QAnon spreads to different places, it starts adapting to different locales. So it starts targeting local representations of the elites at the heart of Q's narratives. So local politicians, for example. In 2020, QAnon conspiracies began spreading on popular misinformation websites in Europe, and European politicians and celebrities began promoting the conspiracy. So again, you're bringing it from the fringe into the limelight, from the deep, dark corners of the internet into a mass audience. Other countries where QAnon is seeing a rise in popularity include Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Brazil. QAnon researcher Marc-Andre Argentino told VOA News that supporters have actually appeared in at least 71 different countries. So with that, I'll turn it back to Gabby to talk some more about misinformation related to COVID-19.
As we mentioned earlier, coronavirus and the spread of coronavirus and this sort of chaos that has surrounded it all over the world this year has led to what the World Health Organization called, quote, an infodemic. Coronavirus is a pandemic, obviously, so what the World Health Organization called an infodemic is an overabundance of information, some accurate and some not, that makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it. So this is referring to the massive amounts of information that exist online about coronavirus. There are reliable sources, the CDC, other public health and government institutions, scientists, experts, and then there are many, many other sources that are spreading false information about the virus. But the way that in February and March and April, as we were first becoming acquainted with coronavirus, so many people were sharing unverified theories about the virus, many that turned out to be completely untrue, that it was possible to go online and really not know what to believe and not be able to sort through it. And this is what the World Health Organization and now many news organizations and other public health bodies have called an infodemic. And we've been responding to this infodemic since February. We launched what we called the Coronavirus Misinformation Tracking Center, where my colleagues at NewsGuard who report on health misinformation have identified 330 websites that have published false information about COVID-19. These are websites in the US and also in Europe that have published verifiably false information. And since the beginning of the year, we've seen type of information that has been spread on these hoax websites change. So at first, many of the false claims about the virus related to its origins. There were some websites that claimed that it had been engineered by scientists in China and released into the world as a bioweapon, a biological weapon. Another narrative claimed that the virus had been stolen by Chinese spies from a land in Canada. Both of these claims were debunked by public health experts, by police, by government officials. And then throughout the pandemic, sites were promoting treatments, false treatments to cure the virus. Of course, as you all probably know, there's no single treatment for the coronavirus, and doctors certainly know more about fighting the virus now than they did at the beginning of the year. But unfortunately, there is not yet one drug that a patient can take to be cured of it. But lots of health misinformation websites have been telling their readers that they have that silver bullet, they have the cure. So one example is colloidal silver, which is liquid silver, which is marketed as sort of a cure-all for coronavirus, for cancer, for whatever ails you, but has been totally rejected by scientists. The FDA warns people not to use it and has actually gone after some websites that sell it. And ultimately, if you drink colloidal silver, your skin will turn blue. So I urge you not to try that. And then other treatments that have been promoted are bleach, high doses of vitamin C. And again, the people who promote these treatments are often trying to sell them to you, the reader. So it's very obvious what their agenda is there. It's not to inform you, it's to get you to buy their product. Now, a lot of the misinformation that we're seeing around coronavirus is related to the vaccine that is currently in the process of being developed by a number of pharmaceutical companies. Of course, there's no vaccine yet that has been released in the US, but even though the vaccine has not yet been finalized, a lot of people on the internet, misinformation publishers are already claiming that it will be dangerous, or that the people who are creating it are only in it for the profit, and trying to undermine the credibility of the vaccine and of the scientists who will ultimately have to promote it. One theory that I'll share about this is that Bill Gates, who has donated tens of millions of dollars in his life to organizations that work on vaccines, not specifically related to coronavirus, but to many other health problems. Certain people view Bill Gates in a conspiratorial light and worry that he is trying to dominate the world because of his support of global philanthropy. And some people have claimed that he supports a coronavirus vaccine because when it is given to you, the vaccine will also include a biochip that will be able to track you, and it will give Bill Gates global domination. That might sound outlandish to you. Unfortunately, a lot of people believe some variation of it, and it spreads very quickly on the internet. So we're working to hopefully help people avoid those websites and find accurate information about their health. And I'll turn it over to Melissa to end the presentation. And I just want to remind you all, if you have questions, please write them in the chat box and we'll address those shortly.
So as we reach the end of our presentation, we just wanted to revisit the many forms of misinformation that we've seen in our work at NewsGuard. There's imposter content, which mimics a trusted source, like talking about the Denver Guardian at the beginning of the presentation. There are hoaxes, which are sensational stories that are designed to go viral, like the Pizzagate conspiracy theory. There's health misinformation, which is running rampant right now, especially because of COVID-19, but can also include false claims about cures for cancer, vaccines, any type of health-related issue. There's conspiracy theories like QAnon, propaganda, which we didn't talk too much about in the presentation, but examples of propaganda might be Russia's reporting on the website RT that 5G cell phone technology can cause cancer or even COVID-19. And then there's sites with a hidden agenda, like the local news sites the sites that claim to be local news, but actually have hidden partisan agendas. So with that, we've presented you with some pretty problematic issues in media these days, and we want to leave you on a bit more of a positive note with some advice for what you can do to help alleviate these problems and get credible information yourself. The easiest way to do this, or the most straightforward way, is to just be a media literate information consumer. So that means evaluating your sources, knowing what you're reading and knowing where the information comes from. Is it a credible website? What are their editorial practices? Things like that. You can evaluate claims. So One of the easiest ways to do that is just open up a new tab on your browser and search for the topic that you're already reading about, and read another article about it in a separate news source and compare the two stories and think about whether they're presenting it in a different way or not. And you also want to consider the motivation of the website that you're reading. Is it straight news, or do they have a partisan agenda that they disclose or perhaps don't disclose? So these are some of the things you can do to help these issues and just help yourself be a more informed media consumer. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming and open it up to some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melissa and Gabby. That was fascinating and fantastic. And really want to thank everyone for joining and listening. As mentioned, we do have a few minutes for Q&A, and please feel free to write your questions in the chat box and we'll be reviewing those. But to start it off, one thing that a lot of people mentioned that was a concern of them when they were registering for this event is how false information could actually be used by people to make important life decisions. And so, how, Melissa and Gabby, how do you think we can help people avoid doing that, avoid making important life decisions based on misinformation or disinformation they come in contact with?
I think a big part of that is doing what we talked about on the last slide, evaluating your sources and knowing where your information is coming from, and knowing if what you're reading has a hidden agenda or if it's giving you the real news that you're looking for. A good example of that is health misinformation. If you're looking for information on a diagnosis that you've gotten, obviously you should talk to your doctor for the most credible information. But if you're reading about your diagnosis online, you want to make sure that you're reading a credible website and not getting bad information that could either not help you or actually harm you.
Yeah, absolutely. One participant is wondering, how does NewsGuard go about discovering ownership and funding of sites to determine their adherence to our transparency standards, or to determine the agenda of the website?
Sure, I can take that. That is a really good and important question. There's a number of ways that we do it. It's a bunch of tools that anyone who's curious can also figure out for themselves. A lot of websites, the most credible websites, will tell their readers this information. So they'll include information about the company that owns them, about their investors, if it's a nonprofit organization, about who their top donors are. Some of the best examples in this front, I'll mention the Texas Tribune, which is a nonprofit journalism organization in Texas. They list any person who has ever given them $1 or more. And that just goes to show readers, of course, that they are willing to be transparent about who's funding them. But for websites that don't make this information clear, which unfortunately is a lot of them and is many of the unreliable websites that we look at, we can look into this online. There's a few ways. We can use the website's corresponding Facebook and Twitter pages, which might have a bit more information. We can look up who registered a website's domain. Sometimes this is information that's kept secret. They'll use an anonymous service, but sometimes they'll have an email associated with it. We can use websites or use tools that track which websites are connected to each other. So if we see that these two websites are related and we know who owns one of them, that can help. Sometimes it does involve a bit of sleuthing. And although this question of who owns a website is not directly related to the content that they're publishing, it's a different question from whether they publish false information. As Melissa spoke about, it's just very important because it gets to the question of whether they're telling readers who they are, what they're doing, and why they're doing it.
Thanks, Gabby. Another question we received is, how can false information impact democracy?
Yeah, so it can absolutely impact democracy in many different ways. Democracy is built on the concept of a free press, and allowing people to make informed decisions about who they're voting for. So if people aren't getting credible, factual information, they might be voting in a non-informed manner or not as informed as they should be to be making those decisions. So democracy could easily be affected by just not having the proper information that you're looking for.
Great, thank you. Another question we got is, what sources can people look at to disprove conspiracy theories, specifically to disprove QAnon theories?
Yeah, that's a really important question. What we do at NewsGuard is look at specific websites, but often we use sources, of course, to get to the bottom of what stories are true, and there are certain websites that we rely on. For example, when it comes to fact-checking, there's a number of fact-checking organizations that we find very useful. PolitiFact is one, Snopes, factcheck.org, and many of the news organizations that bring us news on all topics also have specific bureaus dedicated to responding to falsehoods. So the Associated Press and Reuters are particularly good at this. But I'll also note that on a big topic like QAnon, which has so many facets, and even for the most experienced people working on misinformation and conspiracy theories, can be really hard to get your head around if you don't believe in it, but you're trying to understand it. And so specifically for QAnon, I would recommend an article that was in The Atlantic a couple months ago that it's long, so I'll warn anyone, it's not for the faint of heart, but I'll post the article in the chat box because it explains how QAnon originated and how in the 3 years since it's amassed this huge following, the way that it appeals to different constituencies. And lastly, this is specific to QAnon as well. The FBI has actually designated QAnon to be a domestic terror organization because numerous people in the group have actually gone on to either commit crimes or have been accused of planning certain crimes and been driven to violence, like in the case of Pizzagate, as Melissa mentioned, where a man shot a gun in a DC restaurant. And so that designation coming from the government really says a lot, I think, about this it's not an organization, but this theory's goals and motivations. But as always, when you're looking for information, make sure that the information that you are reading is credible. And unfortunately, conspiracy theories are built on the notion that the world is simple and we're responding to it. So QAnon is trying to show, as Melissa said, we're good, all these other people are evil. That's very simple at heart. But to really disprove what the conspiracy theory is saying in many other realms takes a lot of work, a lot of reporting, a lot of research. And so to really understand it, it will also take a bit of work, but I do think it's worth it.
Yeah, thanks, Gabby. That's absolutely right. We're actually, at NewsGuard, we're working on a report that we're co-producing with ISD, which is a London-based counter-extremism nonprofit and think tank. And we're tracking essentially the spread of QAnon on Facebook over the past few months. And that should be out within a month or two, but can completely, echo that thought, Gabby, that it is very challenging to try to fully understand the theory, but try not to go too deep down the rabbit hole when you when you said about doing that. One more question we got was, how do you parse between misleading but still mostly factual information and then blatantly false information when it's all coming from the same source?
That's a really, really good question. And it's one we struggle with on a daily basis at NewsGuard. And we have lots of discussions amongst our staff about what is misleading and what is false. Is it false enough to ding them on our false content criteria, or is it not quite bad enough to really get to that level? And it really goes on a case-by-case basis, because there's some false information that is just obviously completely blatantly false and made up, and there's just no way that it's true in any way. But there's also a lot of misinformation out there that comes from a grain of truth. So there might be, you can kind of find that grain of truth and say, okay, this is where the conspiracy came from, this is where the false information came from, and kind of just got blown up into something that really wasn't true. So the line is it's very much a gray area, and I guess you could define it by just saying that false information is something that you can definitively disprove, maybe with official documents or something of that, something like that. And misleading information is more toward that grain of truth rather than away from it. So it's more debatable. I know that's not a definitive answer, but I hope it was clear, and I hope that it answered whoever's question that was. But it's something that we're trying to define on a daily basis as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Gabby.
I want to just add one more thing, building off of Melissa's answer. What we do at NewsGuard is look specifically at the level of sources. We're not doing individual fact checks to specific stories. So we're trying to rate a website holistically and say, overall, are they producing reliable content? Are they producing false content and misinformation? And we give them that holistic rating and then hope to let readers decide whether it's a source that they trust. The work of fact checkers is extremely important. We rely on them on a daily basis. But we also are encouraging people to think about the source. Individual stories are also important, but can sometimes be overwhelming to parse. So when you see a link, we hope you're thinking, what is this website? What are their motivations? Do they have a history of publishing other false or misleading content? How does that, relate to this article that I'm looking at right now? And it's something that you have to think about every time that you're online, but we think it's important and makes for, better informed news consumers.
Not just online, anywhere. But yeah, that's absolutely right. Thanks, Gabby. And, we're coming up on time, but I have one more question that I want to give the chance for one of you to answer. And this is a tricky one, so we'll end on a tough note. But one participant asked, many times when I try to point out fake news that my friends are sharing, the source I use, Snopes, etc., to debunk is one that this person's friends will come back to them and say that their sources are lying. So the participant is wondering, how can I combat this when the source you're using to debunk a false claim is being criticized itself and being called false or lying?
Yeah, there's definitely no easy answer to that question, but I commend you for trying to show your friends the credible information. I think one thing that might help is, one reason that people don't believe credible sources is because they end up in a bubble of misinformation. So they start reading misinformation and then they don't believe anything that isn't misinformation because the misinformation is telling them that the mainstream media is lying. So they get wrapped up in a vicious circle of misinformation. So perhaps you could encourage your friend to just read different news sources and not specifically say what you're reading is wrong. Just encourage them to branch out and start getting different perspectives, and perhaps that will get them out of the bubble of misinformation. And I wish you the best of luck, and I hope that it works.
That's great, Melissa. Thanks so much for that. Well, great. We're coming right up on the hour, and just want to thank everyone again for attending. As a reminder, we'll be sending around a link to the recording of this session in case you want to rewatch it, or if you missed part of it or want to share it with friends. And again, thanks so much to all of our public library partners. And if your library is not already a partner, feel free to get in touch. We'd love to have you on board. Have a good evening, everyone. Stay safe out there. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.